Captain Abigail Harper. The voice on the phone was trembling. I was standing in my kitchen at 11:43 on a humid South Carolina night, still half unpacking from my honeymoon, when the man on the other end lowered his voice and said words that froze the blood in my veins. "Abigail, I discovered something terrible. Come to my office immediately, and whatever you do, don't tell your father." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Then he added 5 words that changed my life forever. "It's about your father's DNA. Aline." 30 minutes later, I was driving through downtown Charleston, in full Marine Corps service uniform, my hands locked tight around the steering wheel. Even now, looking back, I can still feel the weight of that drive. The city was quiet, washed in yellow streetlight and summer heat. The harbor breeze carried the smell of salt through my cracked window. Most people were asleep in their tidy homes with porch lights glowing soft against old brick and magnolia trees. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. I remember envying them. At 28, I thought my life was settled, predictable. I'd done everything right. Graduated college with honors. Commissioned into the United States Marine Corps. Earned my captain's bars after 6 hard years of service. Married Daniel, a steady, thoughtful Navy lieutenant who never raised his voice and always made the coffee before I woke. And through it all, my father had stood there like an immovable stone. Richard Harper. Tall, controlled, emotionally reserved. A Charleston businessman who believed discipline was the highest virtue and affection was best left unspoken. He wasn't cruel. Not exactly. But love from Richard Harper came wrapped in expectation. He paid for my education. He attended every promotion ceremony. He shook Daniel's hand at our wedding and said, "Don't disappoint her." But he never hugged me. Not once after childhood. And every time I wore my dress blues, he looked at me with something close to contempt. 2 months earlier, when I stood before family and friends at my promotion ceremony, he leaned close and muttered, "Playing soldier doesn't make you important, Abby." I smiled through it, like always, because he was my father. And because children, even grown ones in uniform, spend their lives trying to earn approval that may never come. St. Joseph Medical Center stood quiet under the moonlight when I arrived. Dr. Michael Carter was waiting at the side entrance. He looked pale, too pale. His gray hair was damp against his forehead, and his usual calm physician's smile was nowhere to be found. "Captain Harper." "What happened?" I asked. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Come with me." He led me down a private corridor toward his office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere distant, a monitor beeped steadily. Hospital sounds. Familiar sounds. My father had been here all week preparing for kidney transplant evaluation. His health had been declining for nearly a year, though he'd fought the diagnosis with his usual stubborn silence. Dr. Carter closed the office door behind us and locked it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about medicine. He crossed to his desk and picked up a sealed folder. Then he looked me straight in the eye. "Captain, before I show you this, I need your word. You won't confront your father until you've seen everything." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "What is this?" He hesitated. Then he slid the file across the desk. "During transplant screening, we ran compatibility DNA analysis." I frowned. "That's standard." "Yes." He swallowed hard. "But your father's results raised an anomaly." I opened the folder. At first, the pages looked like meaningless medical data. Then I saw the highlighted line. Paternity excluded 99.99%. The room tilted. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. "This is wrong." Dr. Carter said nothing. I looked again. The numbers didn't change. "No," I whispered. "No, this is some clerical mistake." He sat slowly across from me. "Abigail, I reran the test 3 times myself." I stared at him. The silence stretched. Then he reached into his desk drawer and removed a second folder. This one older, yellowed at the edges. He placed it gently beside the first. 28 years ago, he said quietly, a paternity analysis was performed at this hospital under sealed authorization. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. By who? He looked ashamed. Your father paid to have the results buried. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Couldn't think. Then with shaking hands, I opened the second file. Inside was another DNA report. Older formatting, official seals, and one line typed cleanly across the page. Biological father match confirmed. Beneath it was a name I knew as well as my own. A name every Marine in America knew. General Nathaniel Reeves, United States Marine Corps. The folder slipped from my hands and struck the floor. I couldn't breathe. General Reeves, America's most decorated living Marine. The man whose portrait hung in command buildings across the country. The man who had pinned my captain's bars on my collar 6 months earlier at Camp Lejeune. The man who had paused afterward, looked into my eyes, and said something I'd never understood. Your mother would have been proud. At the time, I thought it was formal kindness. A polite military blessing. Now those words hit me like artillery fire. Dr. Carter's voice sounded far away. There's more. I looked up slowly. He slid a photograph across the desk. A young woman in marine dress blues smiled beside a younger Nathaniel Reeves. Her hand rested gently against her stomach. My stomach. My knees buckled, because the woman smiling at the camera was my mother. And written on the back, in faded blue ink, were 5 words that shattered what remained of my world. Waiting for Abigail to arrive. I sank into the chair, unable to speak, unable to think, unable to understand how the man I called father had stolen 28 years of truth. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and shock and disbelief, something colder began to rise. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter, something far more dangerous. The need to know why, and once I knew, what I would do with the truth. I did not sleep that night. I drove home just before dawn, parked in the driveway of the Charleston house where I had grown up, and sat behind the wheel staring at the dark windows as if I were looking at a stranger's home. Inside, Daniel was still asleep. Inside, the life I thought I understood was still waiting for me. And somewhere upstairs, folded neatly in a cedar chest I had not opened in 15 years, I suddenly knew there had to be answers. When I finally stepped through the front door, Daniel was already standing in the kitchen. He had that Navy habit of waking instantly alert no matter the hour. His dark hair was rumpled and his expression tightened the moment he saw my face. Abby. I couldn't speak. I simply handed him the file. He read the first page, then the second. Then he looked up slowly and I saw the shock settle into him like cold rain. My God. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The coffee maker clicked on automatically at 5:30, just as it did every morning. The smell filled the room with a comforting familiarity that suddenly felt obscene. Ordinary life continuing while mine had just collapsed. Finally, Daniel sat beside me. Do you believe it? I stared at the polished wood grain of the table. I don't know what to believe. He reached for my hand. I let him take it, though my fingers felt numb. What are you going to do? I thought of Richard. He was still asleep at St. Joseph, probably unaware his entire lie was unraveling. The thought should have comforted me. Instead, it made me sick. I need proof, I said quietly. By 7 o'clock, I was climbing the narrow attic stairs in my childhood home. The house had belonged to my mother before Richard bought out her share after she died. He'd never changed much. Same floral wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, same antique brass fixtures, same faint scent of cedar and old books. The attic was exactly as I remembered. Dusty beams, cardboard boxes stacked with military precision, and in the far corner beneath the small dormer window sat the cedar chest. I hadn't opened it since I was 13. The brass latch resisted before finally giving way with a sharp metallic snap. Inside lay my mother's life. Folded sweaters, a silk scarf, old perfume bottles long dried empty, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in white linen, her Marine Corps dress blues. I froze. My mother had been a Marine. I had never known. Richard had told me she'd been a school teacher. Hands trembling, I unfolded the jacket. Captain's bars gleamed faintly beneath the dust. My breath caught. Captain Eleanor Reeves, not Harper. Reeves. The name struck me like a physical blow. Beneath the uniform lay her dog tags. And under those, letters. Dozens of them tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and opened the first. The handwriting was firm and unmistakably military. My dearest Eleanor, if this deployment keeps me longer than expected, promise me you'll tell Abigail her father already loves her more than life itself. My vision blurred. I opened another. And another. Each signed the same way. Forever yours, Nathaniel? By the 4th letter, I was openly shaking. Then I found the newspaper clipping. The Charleston Gazette, October 1994. Marine Major Nathaniel Reeves presumed killed in classified Beirut operation. A grainy photograph showed a younger version of the man who had pinned my promotion bars. The article explained his body had never been recovered. Presumed dead. I remembered what Richard had always told me. Your mother was widowed young. She never recovered from losing your father. A lie. All of it. Because if Nathaniel had been presumed dead, then Richard had entered her life afterward. He had not been my father abandoned by tragedy. He had been the man who stepped into tragedy and built a lie inside it. At the bottom of the chest sat one final envelope, unsealed. No stamp, no date. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was my mother's. If Abigail ever learns the truth, tell Nathaniel immediately. Richard cannot be trusted to do what is right. The room spun. I read it again. And again. My mother knew. She knew Richard would lie. And she had tried to leave a path back to the truth. A sound behind me made me jerk around. Daniel stood in the doorway, pale as ash. He must have read my face because he crossed the room without speaking and knelt beside me. I handed him the note. He read silently. Then he exhaled long and slow. Abby, she knew. My voice cracked. She knew what he'd do. Daniel sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he said gently, "There's more." I frowned. He handed me his phone. The screen showed a text message from an unknown number. Richard Harper requested immediate discharge from St. Joseph at 6:12 a.m., left against medical advice. My blood ran cold. He knows, Daniel said. I stood so fast the letters scattered across the floor. Number. Daniel rose with me. Abby. No, he doesn't get to run. For 28 years, Richard Harper had controlled every version of my life. He had shaped my childhood, buried my truth, and worn the title of father, while another man grieved a daughter he believed dead. And now that his lie had surfaced, he thought he could simply disappear. Number. I wiped my eyes and squared my shoulders with the reflexive precision of a Marine officer preparing for orders. For the first time in my life, I felt something colder than grief settle inside me. Resolve. Not revenge born of rage. Something cleaner. More exact. Truth. And Richard Harper was going to answer for every stolen year. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again. A second text. 3 words. He's gone home. I looked toward the attic window, toward the long oak-lined driveway below. And right then, through the morning fog, I saw Richard's black sedan pulling slowly into the drive. He had come back. And this time, I was waiting. Richard Harper stood in the center of my childhood living room as if nothing had happened. He wore pressed khakis and a pale blue button-down shirt, the kind he'd worn every Sunday for as long as I could remember. His silver hair was neatly combed. His expression was calm. Too calm. He looked exactly like the man who had raised me. That was what unsettled me most. How ordinary evil can look. When he saw me step into the room, his face softened into something almost fatherly. Abby, he said gently, you're home early. I stared at him. For 28 years, I had looked into that face and seen certainty, stability, authority. Now all I could see was the architecture of deception. Daniel stood quietly behind me, saying nothing. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward him, then back to me. What's wrong? I said nothing. I simply walked forward and placed my mother's note on the coffee table between us. The room went still. Richard looked down. I watched the exact moment recognition struck him. His face lost color. He didn't touch the note. Didn't pretend not to know what it was. He simply closed his eyes for one long second. And when he opened them, he looked 20 years older. Where did you find that? In the attic, I said. My voice surprised me. It sounded calm, steady, marine calm. The kind of calm that comes before action. He exhaled slowly and lowered himself into his leather chair. For a moment, he looked tired enough to tell the truth. Instead, he asked quietly, "Did Carter contact you?" The question itself was answer enough. I folded my arms. Yes. Richard gave a bitter little laugh. I should have known Michael would lose his nerve eventually. The casualness of it made something twist inside me. You paid him to hide my paternity test. His jaw tightened. Yes. The single word hit harder than denial would have. No excuses. No shock. No performance. Just fact. Daniel shifted behind me, but I held up a hand. I wanted this. Needed this. Why? Richard looked at me, then really looked at me, and what I saw there unsettled me more than anger would have. Love. Broken, selfish, desperate love. Because I was afraid. I laughed sharply. Afraid? Yes. He rose slowly and walked to the window, staring out toward the old magnolia tree in the yard. You were 2 years old when your mother died. The words landed like stones. My mother had never been discussed in detail. Richard always dismissed questions with the same answer. It hurts too much. I'd stopped asking by 12. Now his voice was distant, almost reflective. Nathaniel was overseas again. Classified deployment. No contact. The military declared him missing. I said nothing. Richard's shoulders sagged. Eleanor believed he'd come home. She refused to let go. His voice broke slightly. I loved her, Abigail. God help me, I loved her for years before she ever noticed me. The confession filled the room with something ugly and intimate. She was grieving, vulnerable. I told myself I was helping her, protecting both of you. His hands clenched behind his back. Then she became sick. A cold dread crept through me. What happened? He closed his eyes. Cancer. Aggressive. By the time they found it, there was nothing anyone could do. I felt my knees weaken. No one had ever told me that. Not once, Richard continued quietly. She made me promise to care for you if Nathaniel never returned. I swallowed hard. And when he did return, Richard turned toward me. The grief in his face looked real. That was the terrible part. I had already buried her, already held you through your nightmares, already become your father in every way that mattered. His voice roughened. And then Nathaniel came home alive. The room seemed to shrink. He came to Charleston asking questions, looking for Eleanor, looking for you. I could barely breathe. What did you tell him? Richard looked directly into my eyes. I told him you both died. The words struck like a rifle shot. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Then I heard myself whisper, "You let him believe his wife and daughter were dead." Richard's voice cracked. Yes. The honesty made it worse, because there was no defense in it. Only guilt. Only truth. My whole body trembled, but not from weakness. From the effort it took not to shatter. How could you? He stepped toward me. Instinctively, I stepped back. The pain on his face deepened. I loved you. No, I said quietly. My voice was steady now, steel wrapped in sorrow. You loved keeping me. He flinched. And in that moment, I knew I was right. Silence stretched between us. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Does he know? Richard looked confused. Nathaniel. His face tightened. Number. A lie. I saw it instantly. Marine training teaches you to read hesitation the way civilians read weather. His pupils narrowed. His breath caught. His shoulders locked. He was lying. I turned to Daniel. Get my car keys. Richard's composure broke. Abigail, don't. I met his eyes. Where is he? Please, where is he? He looked suddenly afraid. Then he whispered Paris Island. My heart stopped. He's there now. Richard nodded. He requested private leave this morning after Carter called him. Of course, someone had told him. For 28 years, General Nathaniel Reeves had believed his daughter was dead. And right now he knew otherwise. I turned for the door. Richard moved fast for a man his age, catching my arm. Abigail, listen to me. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. The man who had raised me. The man who had lied to me every day of my life. For a brief, impossible second, I remembered being 6 years old with a skinned knee, him lifting me onto the kitchen counter while he bandaged it with careful hands. That memory hurt more than any lie, because part of him had loved me, and part of me had loved him back. Quietly, I removed his hand. Then I said the hardest words I had ever spoken. You don't get to stop this anymore. 2 hours later, I stood at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island. And through the window of the Commandant's private office, I saw him, General Nathaniel Reeves, standing in full dress blues, waiting for me. I had met generals before. In the Marine Corps, rank carries its own gravity. The room shifts when a general officer enters. Conversations sharpen, shoulders straighten, time itself seems to move differently. But nothing prepared me for standing face to face with General Nathaniel Reeves and seeing my own eyes looking back at me. His office at Paris Island was spare and immaculate, exactly what I would have expected from a man whose reputation had become legend in the Corps. Framed commendations lined one wall. A model of the Eagle Globe and Anchor sat centered on a polished walnut shelf. Through the broad windows behind his desk, recruits could be seen crossing the parade deck in perfect formation under the South Carolina sun. He stood when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He was taller than I'd imagined. Late 50s, broad-shouldered, despite age, his silver hair cut close. The years had hardened his face into clean lines of discipline and endurance. But his eyes, those were my eyes, gray-blue, sharp and searching. And suddenly all the breath left my body. He took one careful step toward me as though approaching something fragile enough to break. Captain Harper. His voice was steady, but only just. I stood at attention, automatically, every Marine instinct rising to the surface. Sir? He gave the faintest shake of his head. At ease. I obeyed. He studied my face for what felt like forever. Then he whispered words so quiet I barely heard them. Eleanor's smile. And just like that, whatever professional composure I'd brought with me cracked. I looked away first. The room blurred slightly. He noticed. His voice gentled. "You don't have to stand like a Marine right now." I swallowed hard. I don't know how else to stand. That drew the smallest smile from him, and for one impossible second I felt something shift between us. Recognition. Not certainty, but possibility. He gestured toward the chairs near the window. "Please." I sat. He remained standing for a moment, gathering himself, then lowered into the chair opposite mine with deliberate control. The kind of control men learn when they've spent years carrying grief too heavy to set down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he folded his hands and spoke plainly. "I loved your mother more than I have ever loved anything in this life." The honesty in his voice was devastating. There was no performance in it. No manipulation. Only truth. I nodded for him to continue. He exhaled slowly. "We met at Quantico. She was the finest logistics officer I'd ever seen. Smarter than me, which irritated me tremendously." A faint smile touched his mouth. "She corrected a deployment routing error I'd missed in front of half the battalion, then apologized afterward because she thought she'd embarrassed me. Despite myself, I smiled. That sounded like someone I would have liked." "She was brilliant," he said softly, "and kind in ways this world rarely rewards." He looked down briefly. "We married 6 months later." The words settled heavily between us. Not because they shocked me anymore, but because hearing them aloud made everything real. "She became pregnant with you during my second overseas rotation. We were happy." His voice roughened. "Then Beirut happened. I had read enough military history to know. The classified operation gone catastrophically wrong. Multiple casualties. Survivors extracted weeks later under secrecy orders. He had been one of them. I was listed missing. Communications were blacked out. For 37 days, no one outside command knew whether I was alive." His eyes met mine. "When I came home, Richard met me at Eleanor's gravesite." My stomach clenched. He told me she'd died during childbirth complications, that the baby had died with her. I felt physically ill. The memory of Richard standing in our living room admitting it with such quiet certainty returned like acid. Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. I believed him. The pain in those 2 words filled the room. I could hardly breathe through it. I spent years trying to understand why God would let me survive war only to come home to that kind of loss. He looked toward the parade deck outside. "I considered ending my career, nearly ended my life if I'm honest." I froze. He glanced back at me. "Duty saved me. Sometimes it's all that does." I understood that better than most. He leaned forward then and opened a folder on the table between us. Inside were photographs, my mother laughing beside him on a dock. Their wedding. Ultrasound scans. A grainy photo of Eleanor visibly pregnant smiling directly into the camera. My throat tightened. I touched the edge of one picture with trembling fingers. She kept all these. She mailed duplicates to my deployment address. His jaw flexed. They were returned unopened after I was declared missing. Richard signed for them. The room tilted again. Proof. Cold and absolute. No possibility of misunderstanding. Richard had intercepted everything. For nearly 30 years he had guarded this lie like treasure. And in that moment the shape of my revenge became clear. Not fury. Not destruction. Truth. Public undeniable truth. I looked up. "What do you want from me?" Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. Softened. "Nothing." The word surprised me. He sat straighter. "You owe me nothing, Abigail. Not trust, not affection, not forgiveness for years I couldn't be there." His voice faltered for the first time. I would settle for the chance to know the woman my daughter became. Something inside me broke open then. Not fully, but enough. I looked at this man, the stranger who was not a stranger at all, and saw none of Richard's possession. No claim, only hope, and grief, and love patient enough to wait. That was when my phone rang. "Daniel." I answered immediately. His voice was urgent. "Abby, you need to come home." Ice slid through me. "What happened?" "It's your father." A pause. Then, he emptied every account he had this morning. My pulse hammered. "He's leaving." "No," Daniel said grimly. "He's not leaving." I heard voices in the background, papers shuffling. Then Daniel's next words stopped my heart. "He's gathered the whole family at the house tonight." "Why?" Another pause. When Daniel answered, his voice was heavy with understanding. "He knows the truth is out." I looked at Nathaniel. He was already rising to his feet, and in his eyes I saw exactly what I felt. After 28 years of lies, Richard Harper had finally decided to face judgment. By the time Nathaniel and I reached Charleston, dusk had settled over the city like a heavy curtain. The old Harper house stood lit from end to end, every downstairs window glowing gold against the darkening sky. Cars lined both sides of the oak-shaded street. My father's black sedan sat in the driveway like a silent accusation. He had invited everyone, aunts and uncles, cousins I saw only at holidays, family friends who had known me since childhood, people who had toasted my wedding only weeks earlier and still believed Richard Harper was the proud father of a successful Marine officer. He had gathered witnesses, not to escape, to confess. Nathaniel parked beside Daniel's car and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence inside the vehicle was strange and intimate, filled with everything neither of us yet knew how to say. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "Whatever happens tonight, Abigail, you set the terms." I looked at him. The dashboard light cut soft shadows across his face, revealing both strength and age. This man had commanded thousands, had survived combat loss and 30 years of grief. Yet he was handing control to me without hesitation. It was such a different kind of fatherhood from the one I'd known that it nearly undid me. I nodded once. Together we went inside. The house was silent when we entered. Every conversation stopped. Nearly 20 people stood gathered in the living room. My Aunt Carol's hand flew to her mouth when she saw Nathaniel beside me. Others simply stared. Richard stood near the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel for support. He looked smaller somehow, older than he had that morning. His eyes found Nathaniel first, then me. And for the first time in my life I saw fear in Richard Harper. Not fear of punishment, fear of losing what he had stolen. Daniel stepped quietly to my side. His hand brushed mine once, steadying, grounding. Then Richard spoke. His voice was low and formal. "Thank you all for coming." No one answered. He looked directly at the room. "There are things I have hidden for nearly 30 years. Tonight they end." He glanced toward me. I gave no reaction. Whatever happened next was his burden to carry. He drew a long breath. Then he told them everything. Not elegantly, not defensively. Plainly, he spoke of meeting Eleanor when Nathaniel was deployed, of loving her hopelessly, of caring for her through illness after Nathaniel was presumed dead, of learning she was dying, of the promise she made him swear to care for me if Nathaniel never returned. Then came the moment that changed him from caretaker to thief. When Nathaniel came home alive, Richard said quietly, "I couldn't bear to lose her all over again." The room remained perfectly still. His voice broke. So I lied. No one moved. No one interrupted. He described telling Nathaniel that Eleanor and I had died. Described intercepting letters. Destroying records. Paying doctors to bury DNA results when questions arose years later. Each word stripped him bare, and somehow hearing it all aloud hurt less than I expected. Because truth has a strange mercy. Once spoken, it stops poisoning the dark. When he finished, silence filled the room like prayer. Then Aunt Carol whispered what everyone was thinking. "How could you do something so monstrous?" Richard didn't answer. He simply lowered his head. Then, unexpectedly, he turned toward Nathaniel. The two men faced each other across 30 years of ruin. Richard's voice shook. "I stole your life." Nathaniel said nothing. Richard swallowed hard. "I told myself I loved her, loved Abigail, that keeping them was mercy." He looked at me then, and I saw no manipulation left in him. Only sorrow. But love built on theft isn't love at all. Tears burned my eyes. He had finally understood. Too late. But truly. Before anyone could speak, Richard staggered. His hand flew to his side. His face went gray. Then he collapsed. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Years of military crisis training took over. I dropped beside him, checking airway and pulse, while Daniel called commands to arriving paramedics. Richard's skin was cold and clammy, his breathing shallow. Dr. Carter met us at St. Joseph's emergency entrance. One look at Richard's labs and his face darkened. His kidneys are crashing, faster than expected. They rushed him upstairs. The family remained in stunned clusters throughout the waiting area. No one knew what to say. I sat beside Daniel in numb silence. Across from us, Nathaniel stood at the window looking out over Charleston Harbor, still straight-backed, still composed. But I could see his hands trembling faintly behind him. Dr. Carter returned an hour later. His expression was grave. "There's only one immediate donor match." The room seemed to hold its breath. Carter looked directly at Nathaniel. "General Reeves." The silence that followed felt endless. I stared at him. "Surely not. Not after everything. Not after 30 years stolen." Nathaniel absorbed the news without visible reaction. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Will it save him?" Dr. Carter nodded. "With very strong odds." Nathaniel looked toward Richard's room. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "Prepare the operating room." I rose so quickly my chair scraped harshly against the floor. What? He turned to me. There was no anger in his face. No triumph. Only something deeper. Peace. You don't owe him this, I said. No, he agreed. I don't. Then why? For a moment his expression softened into something almost fatherly. Because it was fatherly. Because if I let bitterness decide this night, he said quietly, then Richard steals one more thing from both of us. My throat tightened. He stepped closer, and in front of our stunned family general, Nathaniel Reeves gently placed a hand on my shoulder. Abigail, revenge reveals character. His voice lowered. Tonight, let ours reveal honor. I broke then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears finally released after 28 years of lies I had never known I carried. And for the first time in my life I leaned into my father. My real father, as orderlies wheeled him toward surgery to save the man who had stolen him from me. Richard Harper survived the surgery. The doctors told us later that if Nathaniel had waited even another hour to agree, Richard likely would have died before morning. I remember sitting in the recovery waiting room just before dawn, staring at the first pale streaks of sunlight spreading across Charleston Harbor beyond the hospital windows. It was one of those quiet southern mornings that always seem older than time itself, the kind where the world feels washed clean. For the first time in 30 hours, no one was speaking. Daniel sat beside me, his hand loosely wrapped around mine. Across from us, Nathaniel rested in a reclining chair, pale from anesthesia, but sitting upright anyway because men like him had spent a lifetime refusing to collapse in front of others. He caught me looking and gave me a faint smile. It was small, tired, real, and something inside me eased. Dr. Carter stepped into the room carrying 2 paper cups of hospital coffee and handed one to Nathaniel. You should be resting. Nathaniel accepted it with a slight nod. I've spent 30 years waiting to know my daughter. I can rest later. The words struck me harder than they should have. Not because they were dramatic, because they weren't. They were spoken with the plain certainty of truth. That was what made them powerful. I had spent most of my life around carefully managed emotions, love rationed out in practical gestures, never spoken too plainly. Richard had believed affection became weaker when named aloud. Nathaniel seemed to believe the opposite. And I realized then how starved I had been for simple honesty. Richard woke late that afternoon. Dr. Carter allowed only immediate family inside. For the first time in my life, that phrase felt complicated. I entered first. He looked impossibly small against the white hospital sheets. The surgery had drained the color from his face. The force that had always defined him seemed diminished, as though truth itself had finally taken something from him. When his eyes opened and found mine, they filled instantly with tears. I had never seen Richard Harper cry. Not when my mother died. Not when I graduated boot camp. Not even when doctors told him his kidneys were failing. But now he wept openly. Abigail. His voice cracked on my name. I stepped closer but remained standing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered why. I knew what he meant. Why had Nathaniel saved him? Why had mercy answered theft? Before I could respond, the door opened behind me. Nathaniel entered slowly, one hand resting lightly against his side. Richard stared at him as though seeing judgment itself. Nathaniel stopped beside the bed. And then he said something I will carry for the rest of my life. You don't get to die before making this right. Richard broke. The sob that escaped him was raw and terrible, the sound of 30 years finally collapsing under their own weight. He covered his face with trembling hands. I'm sorry. Nathaniel said nothing. Richard looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not as possession. Not as proof of his sacrifice. Not as something he had earned. Simply as his daughter, the woman he had wronged. I thought loving you was enough, he whispered. His breathing hitched. I thought raising you gave me the right to keep the truth. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. The room was utterly still. Then he said the words I had needed all my life. I was proud of your uniform. Tears blurred my vision. He shook his head weakly. I mocked it because every medal you earned reminded me whose daughter you truly were. I could hardly breathe. All those years. All those cold dismissals. Not contempt. Shame. A man punishing himself by withholding the pride he could not bear to feel. And suddenly I understood something age teaches better than youth ever can. People do terrible things not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and lack the courage to face it honestly. I stepped to the bedside. Richard looked up, frightened of what I might say. Quietly, I took his frail hand. You were the man who raised me. His breath caught. I looked back toward Nathaniel. And he was the man stolen from me. Then I faced Richard again. Both things are true. His mouth trembled. Can you ever forgive me? I thought of the answer carefully. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing. It is simply choosing not to live forever inside another person's sin. At last I nodded. Yes. He closed his eyes and wept. Not with relief. With gratitude. The honest kind. 6 months later, I stood on the parade field at Camp Lejeune beneath a bright Carolina sky as my promotion ceremony began. Rows of Marines stood sharp in dress blues. Families filled the bleachers. The brass band played softly in the distance. When my name was called, I stepped forward. Major Abigail Reeves Harper. The name had taken time to choose, and healing to deserve. Nathaniel stood on my right in full dress blues. Richard stood on my left, still thinner from recovery, but stronger every week. Together they pinned the gold oak leaves of Major to my collar. One father by blood, one by years, both changed by truth. As the applause rose around us, Nathaniel saluted first. Richard followed awkwardly, having practiced for weeks just to do it properly. I returned both salutes with tears in my eyes. And in that moment, standing between the men who had shaped my life through love and failure alike, I understood the lesson this story was always meant to teach. Secrets may shape a life for a season, but truth, however painful, sets it free. If this story has ever reminded you of someone you need to forgive, or someone who deserves your honesty before time runs out, don't wait. Life humbles all of us eventually. The brave thing is telling the truth before it has to break us open. And if this story moved, you share it with someone who may need that reminder too. And stay with us for more stories about family truth and the quiet courage it takes to come home. The room went silent the moment the camera zoomed in on the cockpit. My brother dropped his beer. My mother covered her mouth. My father leaned forward so quickly that his recliner nearly tipped. And for the first time in years, nobody said a word. On the television screen, the announcer's voice echoed across the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft. Broadcast live to millions of Americans. The same brother who had called me the family failure stared at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. The same parents who had spent years defending him couldn't look away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because the pilot flying across the sky wasn't some stranger. It was me, the daughter they'd overlooked, the sister they'd underestimated, the woman they'd stopped believing in years ago. And the strangest part? I had never lied to them. Not once. They simply never cared enough to ask. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back long before the television cameras. Back before the Air Force. Back before the uniforms. Back before the air shows. Back to a small town in Texas. Back to the day my brother's dream became my burden. And eventually, my future. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 34 years old now. But this story really began when I was a little girl growing up outside Wichita Falls, Texas. Back then, everybody knew who Jake Parker was. Jake was my older brother. 3 years older, 3 years louder, 3 years more confident. And according to nearly everyone who knew us, 3 years more talented. If there was a baseball game, Jake was the star. If there was a school event, Jake got attention. If there was a family gathering, relatives asked about Jake first. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was simply second. Second place becomes familiar when you're the younger sibling of someone everybody expects great things from. The funny thing is that I adored him. I really did. When I was 7 years old, I wanted to wear the same baseball cap he wore. When I was 10, I copied the way he talked. When I was 12, I followed him around so much that he started calling me his shadow. Most little sisters probably understand that feeling. The desire to be included. The desire to belong. The desire to hear an older sibling say they were proud of you. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake had one dream. Flying. He loved airplanes. Loved them. Our bedroom walls were covered with aircraft posters. Fighter jets, bombers. Military aviation magazines stacked everywhere. Air shows were practically holidays in our family. Every summer, Dad loaded us into the truck before sunrise. We'd drive for hours just to watch military aircraft roar across the Texas sky. Jake would stand there with his eyes locked on the horizon, completely mesmerized. 1 year after watching an F-16 demonstration team perform, he turned to Dad and said something I'll never forget. "One day that'll be me." Dad smiled. "I believe it." Mom smiled too. So do I. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted him. Not for a second. And honestly, neither did I. Because Jake had the kind of confidence that made other people believe. As we got older, the dream only grew. Jake joined Civil Air Patrol, earned flight experience, studied aviation constantly. Everything in his life pointed toward becoming a military pilot. By high school, teachers talked about him like he was already destined for greatness. The future seemed written. Then reality arrived. It arrived quietly, in the form of a medical examination. I was 15 when it happened. Jake was 18. I remember the day he came home. No excitement, no smile, no celebration, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something important has broken. Dad sat with him at the kitchen table for hours. Mom cried. Nobody explained anything to me. Not immediately. I eventually learned the truth. Jake had failed a medical qualification required for the flight path he wanted. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked skill. His body simply didn't meet the standard. Years of dreaming ended in a single appointment. Just like that, the Air Force dream disappeared, and something inside Jake disappeared with it. The months afterward were difficult, harder than anyone expected. Jake became angry, then withdrawn, then bitter. Not all at once, slowly, like watching a storm gather in the distance. At first everyone understood, even me. Losing a dream hurts, especially when you've built your identity around it. Mom and Dad became protective, extremely protective. Every conversation revolved around Jake. Every family decision revolved around Jake. Every concern revolved around Jake. Again, I understood, at least initially. But over time, something changed. The family didn't just comfort him. They began excusing him. Everything. His temper, his attitude, his mistakes, his complaints. No matter what happened, the explanation was always the same. He's been through a lot, and he had. But eventually that explanation became permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to blame others. Permission to stop moving forward. Meanwhile, life kept moving, including mine. One afternoon while helping Dad clean the garage, I found an old aviation magazine. The cover featured an Air Force pilot climbing into a fighter jet. I stared at the image for several minutes. Something stirred inside me. The same feeling Jake used to talk about. The same excitement. The same fascination. That night, I started researching military aviation. Quietly. Secretly. I never told anyone. Not even Jake. Especially not Jake, because by then I already knew how he'd react. The dream belonged to him, not me. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Years passed. I graduated high school. Worked hard. Stayed focused. Made plans. Whenever I talked about military service, Jake rolled his eyes. Whenever I talked about aviation, he laughed. The first time he called me the family failure, I was 21. We were sitting around the dinner table. I had just mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked. That's ambitious. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom stared at her plate. I ignored the comment. Then Jake laughed. You've always been the family failure, Emily. Silence. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. Nobody said a word. The silence hurt more than the insult, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. I looked around the table. My parents avoided eye contact. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply don't. Not because they don't love you, because they're too busy protecting someone else. I never argued, never fought back, never demanded fairness. I simply smiled and kept moving forward. Because while my family was still focused on the dream Jake lost, I was quietly preparing to chase it myself, and none of them had any idea how far I was willing to go. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about my brother. Not because he was there. He wasn't. Not because he supported me. He didn't. I thought about him because I knew I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted his entire life. And for a brief moment, I felt guilty. That feeling didn't last long. Reality has a way of pushing sentiment aside, especially when you're trying not to fail. When people imagine military flight training, they often picture excitement, speed, adventure, the kind of scenes you see in movies. The truth is much less glamorous. Most days were exhausting. Long hours, constant evaluations, endless studying, pressure that never seemed to disappear. I joined the Air Force shortly after college. At first, nobody in my family took it seriously. Mom assumed it was temporary. Dad thought I'd eventually come home. Jake laughed outright. How long before you quit? I remember that question clearly. We were standing in my parents' driveway. The Texas sun was setting. I'd just finished loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. I looked at him. I'm not quitting. He shrugged. We'll see. That was it. No good luck. No encouragement. No brotherly support. Just doubt. The strange thing is that by then I'd become accustomed to it. Low expectations are surprisingly easy to carry once you've carried them long enough. Military life changed me quickly. Not because it made me tougher, because it forced me to discover how tough I already was. The first year was difficult. Really difficult. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments when failure seemed more likely than success. The standards were demanding. The competition was intense. Everyone around me had talent. Everyone around me wanted the same opportunities. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about your feelings. Results mattered. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Jake. Nobody saw me as somebody's little sister. Nobody viewed me through the lens of family history. I was simply Emily Parker. Responsible for my own success. Responsible for my own failures. It was strangely liberating. One evening during training, I found myself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sun had disappeared. The air was cool. Several aircraft were parked in the distance. Their silhouettes stood against the darkening sky. I remember staring at them for a long time, thinking about home, thinking about family, thinking about the version of myself everyone back in Texas still believed existed. The family failure. The girl who would never accomplish much. The girl nobody worried about because she wasn't the important one. It struck me then how strange life can be. The people who know us longest don't always know us best. Sometimes they become attached to an old version of who we were, even after we've changed, even after we've grown, even after we've become someone entirely different. Bull. Meanwhile, Jake remained the center of gravity back home. At least according to my parents. Every phone call followed the same pattern. Mom would spend 20 minutes talking about Jake, his job, his frustrations, his latest problem, his newest plan. Then she'd ask about me, briefly. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just habit. Years of family dynamics are hard to break. One Christmas I returned home on leave. The visit lasted 4 days. By the second evening, Jake had already found a way to mock my career. We were sitting in the living room watching football. A commercial featuring military aircraft appeared on television. Jake pointed toward the screen. "Remember when I wanted to do that?" Nobody answered. He looked at me. "I guess somebody had to settle for second place." Mom laughed nervously. Dad cleared his throat. Nobody challenged him. Again. I sat quietly. Again. The silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to stay focused. Enough to understand that their opinion wasn't my future. The irony was that Jake himself had inspired my love of aviation. I don't think he ever realized that. When we were kids, I followed him everywhere. Air museums, aviation shows, books about fighter jets, flight simulators. Every interest he loved eventually became something I loved too. The difference was simple. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. That wasn't because I was stronger. It was because by the time I started, I already knew nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the standards. The responsibility belonged to me. And somehow that made all the difference. So, several years passed. My career advanced steadily. I earned qualifications, completed advanced training, accepted increasingly challenging assignments. Each accomplishment felt meaningful. Not because anyone back home noticed, because I knew how hard I'd worked for it. Success feels different when you've earned it quietly. There's no applause, no celebration, no audience, just private satisfaction. The knowledge that you kept your promises to yourself. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother. The conversation began normally. Weather, family news, small-town gossip. Then she casually mentioned Jake. "He's been having a rough time lately." I wasn't surprised. There always seemed to be something. "What happened?" "Work isn't going well." I listened. As always. Then she sighed. "You know, your brother had such big dreams." The comment wasn't intended to hurt me, but it did. Because I realized something. Even after all these years, my family still viewed Jake as the dreamer. The one with potential. The one whose future mattered. Meanwhile, I was actively living the life he'd once wanted. And somehow they still didn't see it. Not because I hid it. Because they never looked. A few months later, everything changed. I was stationed at an Air Force base in Nevada when the email arrived. At first, I assumed it was routine. Another administrative notice. Another scheduling update. Something ordinary. Instead, it contained an invitation, an opportunity, the kind of opportunity military aviators spend years hoping for. I read it once, then again, then a third time. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished, because the selection board had chosen me for something extraordinary, something prestigious, something that would place me on a national stage. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process it. Then I thought about Jake, about my parents, about every family dinner where I'd been overlooked, about every joke, every dismissal, every moment of silence, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if they ever discovered who I had become. For most of my career, I believed success would feel dramatic. I imagined some life-changing moment, a celebration, a speech, a crowd applauding. Instead, one of the biggest moments of my life happened in a quiet office while I sat alone in front of a computer screen. No audience, no music, no fanfare, just an email, and a future I never saw coming. I must have read the message 10 times, maybe more. The words never changed. Neither did the outcome. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. The selection process was brutally competitive. Outstanding pilots from across the service applied. Most never made it. Many applied more than once. Some spent years hoping for the opportunity. And somehow my name had ended up on the list. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Aircraft moved across the flight line outside. Maintenance crews worked beneath the Nevada sun. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same. Because after years of quiet effort, somebody had noticed. Somebody had looked beyond evaluations and flight hours and seen potential. The realization was overwhelming. Not because I needed validation. Because I'd spent so many years without it. That evening I called my parents. Part of me wanted to share the news. Part of me still hoped. Even after all those years, even after all the disappointments, there is something inside most daughters that never fully stops wanting their parents to be proud. Mom answered on the second ring. We exchanged the usual greetings, talked about weather, neighbors, family updates. Then I told her, I got selected for something important. Oh, there was genuine interest in her voice. I smiled. One of the biggest opportunities of my career. That's wonderful, honey. For a moment I felt encouraged. Then she asked, did I tell you Jake is thinking about changing jobs? And just like that, the moment disappeared. Not because she meant to hurt me. Because old habits are powerful. The conversation drifted back toward Jake, as it always seemed to. 20 minutes later, we hung up. I sat staring at my phone. Not angry. Not even disappointed. Mostly resigned. I understood my family by then. The rules rarely changed. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. The new assignment required additional preparation, additional training, additional responsibilities. The standards were higher. The expectations were higher. Everything was higher. I loved every minute of it. The work demanded precision, professionalism, discipline. Every detail mattered. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision mattered. There was no room for complacency. And strangely enough, that made me feel alive. Because for years I had quietly carried other people's expectations. Now I was focused entirely on my own. Back home, however, very little changed, at least not from my family's perspective. Whenever I visited Texas, I seemed to step back into the same role. The overlooked daughter, the younger sister, the safe target. One summer afternoon, my parents hosted a family barbecue, the kind of gathering common across America. Paper plates, lawn chairs, children running through sprinklers, country music playing softly in the background. Everybody relaxed. Everybody comfortable, at least until Jake arrived. By then he was 37, still charismatic, still funny, still capable of making an entire group laugh. The difference was that the laughter felt different now, less joyful, more defensive. Success had never fully replaced the dream he'd lost, and I think part of him knew it. I was helping Dad near the grill when Jake walked over. Emily. Jake. He glanced at my sunglasses, then at my Air Force shirt. A familiar smirk appeared. I knew what was coming. Some things never change. So how's the military? It's good. You still doing that? I laughed softly. Last time I checked, several relatives nearby chuckled. Jake shook his head dramatically. I figured you'd be tired of playing soldier by now. The conversation around us grew quieter. People sensed tension. They always did. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. I looked at him. I like what I do. He shrugged. Good for you. Then he took a sip of his drink. And here I thought you'd eventually get a real job." Several people laughed awkwardly. The kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. I noticed my mother looking down, my father focusing on the grill. Neither said anything. Again, the moment should have hurt. Years earlier it would have. Instead, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Pity. Not for myself. For Jake. Because I suddenly realized he was still fighting a battle that had ended years ago. The dream was gone. The disappointment was real. But he refused to leave that chapter behind. And it was costing him. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on my parents' back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead. Crickets filled the darkness. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecue smoke. Dad eventually joined me. For several minutes we sat quietly. Then he sighed. "Your brother gives you a hard time." I smiled. "A little." He stared toward the yard. "You know he doesn't mean all of it." There it was. The familiar defense. The explanation. The excuse. I had heard versions of it for years. Normally I let it pass. This time I didn't. "Dad..." "Yeah." When was the last time somebody asked him to stop? The question lingered. Neither of us spoke. Finally he looked away. And that answer told me everything. A few weeks later, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The event would attract enormous attention. Millions of viewers. National exposure. The kind of aviation spectacle people planned weekends around. I knew immediately that my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show. Never. Even after all these years. Especially not one this big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The little girl who had followed her brother through aviation museums and air shows was now preparing to fly in one. Not as a spectator. Not as a fan. As part of the show itself. Yet nobody back home knew. Not Jake. Not Mom. Not Dad. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in telling them. Because some truths don't need announcements. Sometimes life reveals them on its own. And when it does, the lesson tends to be unforgettable. The morning of the air show began long before sunrise. Most people only see the performance.
The aircraft.
The smoke trails. The precision formations. The applause. They don't see the preparation. The briefings. The inspections. The hours of planning. The responsibility. And they certainly don't see the quiet moments when a pilot sits alone and realizes thousands, sometimes millions of people are about to watch. I remember standing beside the aircraft while the sky was still dark. The air was cool. The flight line lights reflected against polished metal. Ground crews moved efficiently around us. Everything felt calm, professional, routine. Yet beneath that routine was excitement. Not nervous excitement, gratitude. Because I knew exactly how many people would have traded places with me. Including my brother. A few hundred miles away, my family was starting their day too. Though I wouldn't learn the details until later. According to my mother, Jake arrived early. Earlier than anyone expected. He carried coffee and donuts. The way he used to whenever a big air show was on television. Apparently he was excited. Like a kid again. That part made me smile when I heard it later. Because despite everything, Jake had never stopped loving aviation. Not really. He had simply stopped believing it could be part of his own future. Those are very different things. Back at the airfield, pilots gathered for the final briefing. Weather, safety procedures, flight schedules, communication plans, the usual details. Everyone focused. Everyone professional. Nobody treated the day casually. The crowd expected perfection. And perfection requires preparation. As the briefing concluded, one of the senior officers looked around the room, then smiled. "Let's give them a show they'll remember." The room responded with quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Professional pride. There is a difference. Meanwhile, my parents had settled into the living room. My father occupied his favorite recliner. My mother sat on the couch. Jake claimed the seat closest to the television. Some things never change. The network coverage began around noon. Commentators discussed aircraft, pilots, history, upcoming demonstrations. Jake reportedly corrected the announcers several times, at least according to my mother. That sounded exactly like him. For all his flaws, he knew aviation. Always had. He pointed out aircraft models, explained maneuvers, shared facts nobody else knew. For a little while, the old Jake returned. The enthusiastic boy from those childhood air shows. The brother I used to admire. The brother I missed. By early afternoon, I was climbing into the cockpit. That moment never gets old. The smell, the equipment, the routine. Every pilot develops habits. Personal rituals, small actions that signal it's time to focus. I followed mine carefully. Checklists, communications, systems, everything exactly as trained. Everything exactly as practiced. Then I looked out across the airfield. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing areas. Families, veterans, children, aviation enthusiasts, people from all over America. Some wore military hats decorated with unit patches. Others carried folding chairs and cameras. Many had been attending air shows for decades. I felt honored to be there, truly. Because opportunities like this don't belong to one person. They're built on years of support from instructors, mentors, crews, and teammates. Nobody reaches that stage alone. The demonstration began. Aircraft launched. Formations assembled. The performance unfolded exactly as planned. From the cockpit, the world looked different. Cleaner. Simpler. Focused. There is a unique clarity that comes during flight. The noise disappears. The distractions disappear. Only the mission remains. For a while, family never entered my mind. Neither did Jake. I was too busy flying. Too busy doing the job? Back in Texas, the television broadcast continued. The commentators introduced various segments. Different aircraft. Different pilots. Different demonstrations. My family watched casually. Interested. Entertained. Completely unaware of what was coming. Then the production team switched to a featured segment. A closer look at one of the demonstration pilots. The camera followed a pilot walking toward an aircraft. Helmet under one arm. Flight gear perfectly fitted. Professional. Confident. The announcer began speaking. And everything changed. According to my father, Jake stopped moving first. Not speaking. Not breathing. Moving. The announcer continued. Leading today's demonstration is Major Emily Parker. My name. Clear as day. Impossible to misunderstand. My mother later told me she thought she'd heard it wrong. She looked at the screen. Then looked again. Then sat frozen. The camera zoomed closer. Close enough to remove all doubt. There I was. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same name. Me. The daughter. The sister. The family failure. Eliu. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say. For years they had imagined my military career as something small, ordinary, temporary. Background noise. Now reality was sitting in their living room. Broadcast nationwide. Impossible to ignore. The silence lasted several seconds. Maybe longer. Nobody remembers exactly. Shock has a strange effect on time. The aircraft accelerated. The demonstration continued. And for the next several minutes my family watched without speaking. Every maneuver. Every formation. Every pass across the sky. Jake never looked away. Neither did my parents. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. The daughter they overlooked. The sister they underestimated. The dream they thought belonged only to Jake. All of it unfolding before them. Not through an argument. Not through revenge. Not through confrontation. Through truth. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to speak. Nobody joked. Nobody changed the subject. The room remained quiet. My father eventually stood. Walked into the kitchen. Then came back. Still speechless. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Jake remained seated, staring at the blank television screen. The same screen that had just revealed everything. The next morning, while I was reviewing post-event schedules at my temporary quarters, somebody knocked on the door. A firm knock. Unexpected. I opened it, and found my brother standing there. He looked exhausted. Like a man who hadn't slept. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jake took a deep breath, and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. We need to talk. For most of my life, I imagined what I would say if Jake ever admitted he was wrong. I pictured arguments. Long speeches, years of frustration finally pouring out. I imagined telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me, exactly how many family dinners I'd endured, exactly how many times I'd sat quietly while everyone acted as if my life didn't matter. But when I opened that door and saw him standing there, none of those speeches seemed important anymore. Because Jake didn't look like a man ready to argue. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, something he'd been carrying for years. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. Sure. The room was quiet. Small. Temporary. Military housing isn't glamorous. Never has been. Jake looked around. His eyes settled on framed photographs sitting on a shelf. Flight school. Graduation ceremonies. Squadron pictures.
Awards.
Years of memories. Years of work. Evidence of a life he had never bothered to ask about. For several moments he simply stared. Then he shook his head. I didn't know. No, I said gently. You didn't. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the same way we'd sat across from each other at hundreds of family meals. Yet this felt entirely different. For once nobody else was there. No parents, no relatives, no audience. Just us. Jake folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then folded them again. A nervous habit I'd almost forgotten he had. Finally he spoke. When did all this happen? I smiled. What part? He gestured toward the photographs. The career. The flying. The air show. I laughed softly. Over the last 12 years, the answer wasn't meant to be sarcastic. But it landed that way anyway. Because the truth was obvious. My life hadn't been a secret. He simply hadn't been paying attention. Jake stared down at the table. I feel stupid. I considered that. Then shook my head. No. His eyes lifted. No. No, I think you're finally being honest. That answer seemed to surprise him. For several seconds he sat quietly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. The conversation moved slowly after that, like two people trying to cross a damaged bridge. Carefully. One step at a time. Eventually Jake leaned back in his chair. I hated watching that air show. The statement caught me off guard. Hated it. He nodded. I was proud of you. Then he looked away. And I hated it. Now I understood. Not because I shared his feelings. Because I finally understood their source. Why, I asked. Jake laughed bitterly. Because that was supposed to be me. There it was. The truth. Not jealousy. Not really. Grief. Old grief. Unresolved grief. The kind people carry so long they forget they're carrying it. For the next hour, Jake talked more honestly than I had ever heard him talk before. He told me about the medical disqualification, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the feeling of watching his future disappear. I already knew most of the facts. What I didn't know were the emotions behind them. The fear, the shame, the anger, the loneliness. For years, everyone had focused on the dream he lost. Very few people had focused on the person who lost it, including Jake himself. I kept thinking I'd find something else, he admitted. Something that felt the same. Did you? He shook his head. No, the answer came immediately. Too immediately. The kind of answer somebody has lived with for years. I got jobs. He shrugged. I made money. I paid bills. But none of it ever felt like flying. I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Because every person reaches a point where they discover the difference between making a living and feeling alive. Jake never found the second part. Then his eyes met mine. And then there was you. I stayed quiet. You kept going. Another pause. You lived the dream. The words sounded painful, but also freeing. Like finally admitting something he'd spent years avoiding. I nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in my life, I didn't minimize it. Didn't soften it. Didn't apologize for it. I had earned it. And both of us knew it. Jake rubbed his face. I think I started blaming you. The honesty startled me, even though I'd suspected it for years. You? He nodded. It didn't make sense. I knew that. But every time you succeeded, his voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. It reminded you. He nodded. Exactly. Every achievement, every promotion, every step forward had reminded him of the path he'd lost. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me. The strange thing was that hearing the truth didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Because I suddenly saw how much energy he'd wasted. Years of resentment. Years of comparison. Years spent staring backward instead of forward. And for what? Nothing. Not 1 minute of it had changed the past. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Nobody quite knew how to begin. Then my mother surprised everyone, including herself. She started crying. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from realization. We failed you, she said. I blinked. What? She looked directly at me. We failed you. The room went silent. Dad stared at the table. Jake looked down. Mom continued. We were so worried about your brother. Her voice trembled. We forgot you needed us too. I didn't know what to say. Because I'd imagined apologies before. Many times. But reality felt different. Messier. More human. Less satisfying. And somehow more meaningful. Dad finally spoke. We thought we were helping him. You were, I said. He nodded. Maybe. Then he sighed. But we stopped seeing what it was costing you. Nobody argued, because everybody knew it was true. Eventually the conversation softened. The tension eased. The honesty remained. For the first time in years, we weren't pretending. And that mattered. More than revenge. More than being right. More than winning. Before leaving that evening, Jake walked me to my car. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange over the Texas horizon. He stood quietly for a moment, then asked a question. A simple question, but one that carried the weight of years. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at him, and for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For years I thought I knew exactly how I would answer that question. Why didn't you ever tell us? I imagined saying something dramatic, something sharp, something that would finally make everyone understand. But standing there beside my car looking at my brother, I realized the answer was much simpler than that. I did tell you. Jake frowned. What? I told you every time somebody asked. The confusion remained. So I smiled. I joined the Air Force. He nodded. I know. I told you when I graduated training. Another nod. I told you when I got promoted. Yeah, I told you when I changed assignments. His expression slowly shifted. The pieces were finally connecting. I wasn't talking about secrets. I was talking about attention. For years, the information had been available. Nobody had listened. Not really. Not completely. Not with genuine curiosity. Jake stared toward the fading horizon, then laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they'd spent years avoiding. We never asked. No, we didn't. And somehow those 3 words carried more honesty than anything he'd said before. Oh, on the flight home the next day I spent a lot of time looking out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. The world seemed peaceful from 30,000 feet. Smaller somehow. Less complicated. Distance has a way of doing that. Problems that feel enormous on the ground often look different from above. Not insignificant. Just easier to understand. For years I had carried resentment toward my family. Not overwhelming resentment. Not hatred. Just a quiet ache. The ache of feeling unseen. The ache of watching someone else's pain matter more than your own. The ache of realizing that being the dependable child often means receiving less attention than the struggling one. Many people my age understand that feeling, especially those who grew up in families where one person's crisis became everybody else's priority. Looking down at those clouds, I finally understood something. My parents hadn't loved me less. They had simply worried about Jake more. Those aren't the same thing, and while that realization didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand it. Understanding changes things. Over the next several months, something unusual happened. My family started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. Slowly. Naturally. Mom called more often. Not to discuss Jake, to ask about me. The first time it happened, I almost laughed. She called one evening while I was making dinner. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I actually paused, because I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked. Not politely. Not out of obligation. With genuine interest. We spent nearly 40 minutes talking. About aviation. Travel. Career goals. Life. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Smiling. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives through small questions that should have been asked years ago. Dad changed too. Though in his own way. One afternoon he mailed me a newspaper clipping. A local article about aviation. Nothing particularly special. Except for the handwritten note attached. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad. That was it. 12 words. Yet I probably read them 20 times. Because after years of feeling overlooked, even small signs of recognition carry enormous weight. So, the biggest change, however, came from Jake. Not immediately. Growth rarely happens immediately. But it happened. Gradually. Steadily. One choice at a time. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing our lives. Stopped measuring his losses against my successes. Stopped treating every accomplishment of mine as evidence of his failure. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. One evening he called me unexpectedly. I signed up for flight lessons. I nearly dropped my phone. What? He laughed. You heard me. I sat down. Honestly stunned. At 37 years old, Jake wasn't trying to become a fighter pilot. That chapter was over. He knew it. I knew it. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was reconnecting with the thing he loved instead of mourning the thing he lost. That mattered. A lot. "How was it?" I asked. There was a pause. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from him in years. Pure excitement. "It was incredible." And just like that, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows again. The boy who stared at airplanes with wonder. The boy who dreamed without bitterness. The boy I'd missed. The following summer, another major air show came to Texas. This time my family attended in person. Not because I asked, because they wanted to. Mom brought sunscreen. Dad brought binoculars. Jake showed up wearing an aviation cap that looked older than some of the spectators. The sight made me laugh. Before the event began, we stood together near the flight line. The sun was bright. The crowd was enormous. Children pointed toward aircraft. Veterans shared stories. Families spread blankets across the grass. America has a special relationship with air shows. They're part celebration, part history lesson, part family tradition. Standing there with my parents and my brother felt strangely emotional, not because I was flying, because for the first time in years we were sharing the experience together. No resentment, no competition, no old arguments, just family. Later that afternoon, after the demonstration ended, we sat together watching the crowd disperse. Jake nudged my shoulder, a familiar gesture from childhood. "I was wrong about you." I smiled. "You were wrong about a lot of things." He laughed. "Fair enough." Then his expression softened. "I'm proud of you, Em." The words were simple, ordinary, yet somehow they meant more than any television broadcast ever could. Because this wasn't about being seen by millions of strangers. It was about being seen by the people who mattered. As I look back now, I realize something important. The greatest victory wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't earning wings. It wasn't proving anybody wrong. The greatest victory was learning that my worth never depended on their approval. Not my brother's. Not my parents'. Not anyone's. Once I understood that, everything changed. Success became lighter. Relationships became healthier. Life became richer. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they underestimate us. Sometimes they carry wounds that prevent them from recognizing our strengths. But we don't have to wait for recognition before moving forward. We don't have to wait for applause before becoming who we're meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or perhaps a chapter of your own journey, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on it. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working towards something meaningful, remember this. Keep going. The people around you may not see your progress right away, but that doesn't make it any less real. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts, share this story with someone who might need it, and join me again for another journey. The champagne glass shattered so hard against the hardwood floor that the entire ballroom-style patio went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something deeply unexpected cracks the air wide open. A second earlier, my cousin Rick had been laughing so hard he nearly spilled barbecue sauce on his white polo shirt. "Let me guess," he snorted loudly enough for half the party to hear. "They called you Princess." I'd taken a slow sip of iced tea before answering. Hades. That was it, just one word. But the retired Navy SEAL standing near the outdoor bar dropped his champagne glass like he'd seen a ghost. The old man stared at me with pale blue eyes that suddenly looked 20 years younger and 20 years more afraid. "No," he whispered. Then he stood up straight and saluted me, right there in front of my entire family. That was the moment my cousin realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The barbecue was supposed to be simple. Just one afternoon. My Aunt Donna's 75th birthday party out near Waco, Texas. Nothing fancy, folding chairs, country music drifting from old speakers, men arguing about football beside smokers full of brisket, grandkids running around with popsicles melting down their wrists. Real American family stuff. I almost didn't come. Truthfully, I hadn't attended one of these gatherings in nearly 8 years. Families remember things, especially the embarrassing things. And in my family, I was mostly remembered as the strange one, the quiet one, the woman who disappeared into the army and never really came back. Most of them assumed I had worked some forgettable desk job pushing paperwork around military offices. I never corrected them. It was easier that way. At 53 years old, I'd learned something most people only understand after enough funerals: peace matters more than recognition. Still, Aunt Donna had called personally. "Claire," she'd said softly over the phone, "I'm getting old, sweetheart. I'd really love to see you. So I drove the 3 hours. I brought peach cobbler. And I promised myself I'd leave before sunset if Rick started drinking too much. Unfortunately, Rick started drinking before noon. My cousin had always been loud in the way insecure men usually are. He wasn't evil, just arrogant. The type who believed volume was the same thing as confidence. He sold RVs outside Dallas and treated every conversation like he was trying to win Employee of the Month. By the time I arrived, he was already working through imported beer and holding court near the grill. Well, look who finally came back from Area 51, he barked when he saw me. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. You still alive, Rick? Barely. Inflation's trying to kill me. That got another round of laughter. I hugged Aunt Donna, kissed her cheek, helped carry trays from the kitchen to the patio while everyone else sat around debating politics and gas prices. Nobody noticed. I preferred it that way. Around 4 o'clock, a black SUV rolled into the driveway. Out stepped an older man wearing a navy blazer despite the Texas heat. Tall, lean, white hair cut military short. Even before Aunt Donna introduced him, I recognized the posture. Combat veterans carry themselves differently. Doesn't matter how old they get. This is Walter Briggs, Aunt Donna announced proudly. He served with Harold years ago. Harold had been her late husband. Walter shook hands around the patio until his eyes landed on me. For a split second, something changed in his expression. Recognition, then confusion, then uncertainty. I looked away first. I should have known right then the day was about to go sideways. By early evening, Rick had moved from annoying to obnoxious. He'd gathered a small audience around the patio cooler and started telling stories about his high school football days like he'd almost made the NFL. I was sitting quietly near the railing, watching sunlight settle over the fields beyond Aunt Donna's property, when Rick wandered over holding a beer. So he said loudly, "You ever actually do anything dangerous in the army?" I shrugged. Sometimes. What's that mean? It means sometimes. A few cousins chuckled. Rick grinned wider. You shoot guns and all that. Occasionally. Fight anybody. His tone had that teasing edge men use when they think they're cornering someone. I could feel Walter Briggs watching from across the patio. I should have shut the conversation down. Instead, maybe because I was tired. Or maybe because after 20 years I was exhausted, pretending to be smaller than I was. I answered honestly. Only hand to hand, I said calmly. Knives were optional. The entire group burst out laughing. Rick slapped the table. Oh, come on. I smiled into my tea glass. Then came the line. Let me guess. He laughed. They called you princess. I looked him directly in the eye. Hades. The champagne glass shattered 1 second later. Walter Briggs had gone completely pale. Not shocked pale, haunted pale. The old SEAL stared at me like he was looking straight through 20 years of buried memories. No damn way, he whispered. Rick blinked. What? Walter slowly approached me. You were Task Unit 7, he said quietly. I didn't answer. You flew Kandahar extraction routes. Still silent. Walter's breathing changed. My family looked back and forth between us, confused. Rick forced out a laugh. Okay, hold on, what's happening? Walter ignored him completely. He looked at me the way soldiers look at graves. I heard you were dead. The patio had gone still except for distant cicadas buzzing in the trees. I set my glass down carefully. Not dead, I said softly. Walter's eyes glistened slightly. My God, he whispered. Hades. Then in front of my entire family. The retired Navy SEAL straightened his back and saluted me. And for the first time in my life, my cousin stopped laughing. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Walter Briggs saluted me. Not even Rick. And trust me, getting Rick Donnelly to stop talking was impressive enough to qualify as a small miracle. The Texas evening breeze moved softly through the oak trees around Aunt Donna's property while everybody stared at me like I'd suddenly grown another head. I hated attention. Always had. That surprise people felt when they discovered who I used to be. It never felt satisfying the way movies make it seem. Mostly it just made me tired. Rick finally forced out an awkward laugh. Okay, he said, glancing around nervously. What exactly is going on here? Walter didn't answer immediately. The old SEAL kept staring at me with the kind of expression veterans only wear around certain names, certain memories. Finally, he looked at Rick. You got any idea who your cousin is? Rick smirked weakly. Apparently not. Walter nodded slowly. No, he said. Apparently not. Aunt Donna looked deeply confused now. Claire, she asked carefully, what is he talking about? I sighed softly and leaned back in my chair. Nothing important. Walter immediately shook his head. With respect, he said, that's not true. I could feel every pair of eyes on me now. My younger cousins had stopped chasing their kids around the yard. Even the country music humming from the speakers suddenly seemed too loud. I hated this. For 20 years I'd worked very hard to become invisible, and invisibility is hard-earned, especially after war. Walter finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me. You really disappeared, he murmured. I meant to. He gave a quiet laugh through his nose. Hell, people talked about you like a ghost story. Rick folded his arms. Okay, somebody better start explaining. Walter glanced toward him. You ever hear soldiers talk about call signs? Sure. Well, Walter said carefully, most call signs are jokes, nicknames, dumb stories. He pointed toward me. Not that one. Rick looked at me, then back at Walter. You're serious? Walter's eyes never left mine. Son, there were Rangers, SEALs, Marines, pilots, men who owed their lives to her. The patio fell silent again. I could almost hear people mentally replaying every assumption they'd ever made about me. The weird cousin, the quiet loner, the unmarried woman who lived alone outside Temple with her old truck and vegetable garden. Funny how people build entire stories around silence. Rick scoffed lightly, trying to recover. Come on, he said, you're acting like she was Rambo. Walter's expression hardened instantly. No, he said quietly. Rambo was fiction. That shut Rick up. Aunt Donna slowly sat beside me. Claire, sweetheart, what did you do in the army? I looked down at my hands for a moment. At my age, your hands tell stories before your mouth does. Scars, burn marks, old fractures. I flew medevac support, I said simply. Walter corrected me immediately. You flew black zone extraction. I closed my eyes briefly. Still hated hearing those words. Most civilians have no idea what military pilots actually do in war zones. They imagine movies, flags, hero speeches. Real war is usually exhaustion mixed with terror. And helicopters, God. Helicopters are where fear becomes physical. You feel every vibration in your bones. Every sound matters. Every second matters. Walter leaned back slowly. Kandahar, he murmured. Fall of 2003. I said nothing. Rick frowned. What happened in Kandahar? Walter looked toward the darkening fields beyond the patio. The mission went bad. His voice had changed now. Quieter. Older. There was a SEAL recon unit trapped after an ambush outside the city. Sandstorm rolling in. Visibility collapsing. Enemy fighters everywhere. Several relatives were completely still now, Walter continued. Command told air support to back off. He looked directly at me. But one pilot ignored the order. I stared at my untouched tea. That wasn't bravery, I said quietly. It was anger. Walter shook his head. No, he replied. It was courage. I almost laughed at that. People who survive war often get called courageous by people who never saw how much fear was involved. Truth is, courage usually feels ugly, messy, desperate. Rick still looked unconvinced. So what? She rescued some soldiers. Walter turned toward him slowly. Son, he said, those men were already considered dead. That landed differently. Even Rick felt it. Walter pointed gently toward me. She flew into a sandstorm nobody else would touch. My throat tightened slightly. I still remembered the radio static, the screaming alarms, the taste of blood where I'd bitten through my lip. Some memories never fade. They just get quieter with age, Walter continued. The helicopter got hit twice. Aunt Donna gasped softly. But she still landed. Nobody spoke. Even the little kids nearby seemed to sense something heavy in the air. Rick cleared his throat. Well, if all this is true, why haven't we ever heard about it? That answer came easily. Because I didn't want you to. Everyone looked at me again. I finally lifted my eyes. You know what happens after enough war? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. You stop wanting attention. The breeze shifted across the patio. Somewhere down the road a dog barked. Very normal sounds. That's the strange thing about life-changing moments. The world keeps moving anyway. Walter studied me carefully. You still blame yourself. I gave him a tired smile. Occupational hazard. He leaned forward. You saved 31 men. Not all of them. Walter's face darkened slightly. No, he admitted quietly. That old ache moved through my chest again. Not sharp anymore. Just familiar. Aunt Donna reached over and gently touched my arm. Oh, Claire. I looked away. I'd spent decades making sure nobody pitied me. Pity was dangerous. Once people start feeling sorry for veterans, they stop seeing them as human beings. They either turn you into a hero or a tragedy. Neither one feels real. Rick suddenly shifted awkwardly beside the cooler. So, he rubbed the back of his neck. Why'd they call you Hades? Walter answered before I could. Because no matter how bad the situation got, he paused. She always went into hell to bring people home. Nobody laughed after that. Not one person. The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the Texas sky orange and purple beyond the trees. Walter kept staring at me with unsettled eyes. Then his expression changed. Not admiration this time. Concern. Deep concern. Claire, he said carefully, why did you disappear after Kandahar? My stomach tightened instantly. There it was. The question I'd spent 20 years outrunning. Around us, the party noises faded into uneasy silence, because the truth was, Kandahar wasn't the reason I vanished. It was what happened after. The air changed after Walter asked that question. Even the breeze across Aunt Donna's patio seemed to slow down. Why did you disappear after Kandahar? Nobody touched their food anymore. Rick lowered his beer. My younger cousins looked confused and uncomfortable, like they were suddenly realizing the strange older woman at family cookouts had lived an entire life. None of them understood. I stared out across the dark Texas fields for several long seconds before answering. Because some things follow you home, I said quietly. Walter's face tightened. He already knew, at least part of it. But my family didn't. And once certain stories are spoken out loud, you can't put them back into silence. I folded my hands together slowly. Kandahar wasn't supposed to become a rescue mission, I began. The memories came back sharper than I wanted. Funny how trauma works. You can forget birthdays, phone numbers, names. But fear stays preserved like glass. It started as a routine extraction support operation, I continued. Small recon unit, in and out before sunrise. Walter nodded once. The sandstorm hit early, he added quietly. Yeah. I could still remember the sky turning orange-black over Afghanistan. One moment visibility was manageable. The next moment it looked like the world itself was collapsing. We lost communications twice, I said. Then the recon team got ambushed moving toward the extraction point. Rick shifted in his chair. What kind of ambush? The kind where people stop coming home. That shut him up again. I leaned back slowly. The enemy already knew where they were headed. Heavy gunfire, RPGs, 2 men down immediately. Aunt Donna pressed a hand against her chest. Oh my lord. I kept going because stopping would have been worse. The command channel ordered all air units to withdraw. Walter looked down at the table. Nobody liked that part. Especially veterans. Because sometimes war isn't about bravery. Sometimes it's about watching institutions protect themselves first. The storm was getting worse, I continued. One pilot turned back. Then another. And you didn't, Walter said softly. I shook my head. No. Rick frowned. Why not? I looked directly at him. Because they were still alive. Simple as that. The room stayed quiet. Older Americans understand something younger people often don't. When you've lived long enough, the plain truths usually hit the hardest. I closed my eyes briefly. I remember hearing one of the SEALs over the radio, I said. Could barely understand him through the static. Walter's jaw tightened. He was praying, he muttered. Yeah. I swallowed carefully. He thought nobody was coming. The patio had become so silent I could hear insects humming beyond the fence line. I flew blind for most of the final approach, I said. Couldn't see terrain, couldn't see enemy movement, could barely see my own instrument panel. Rick looked genuinely unsettled now. And you still landed. Hardest landing of my life. The old memories moved through me again. Rotor vibration, dust choking the cockpit, warning alarms screaming. Then the gunfire. God, the gunfire. Bullets tore through the left side before we even touched ground, I said quietly. Aunt Donna covered her mouth. Walter looked exhausted just hearing it again. The SEAL team was already carrying wounded when I landed, I continued. One man missing part of his leg, another barely conscious. Rick whispered Jesus. I ignored the sympathy in his voice. I wasn't interested in sympathy anymore. Not after all these years. We loaded everybody we could, I said. Then another RPG hit nearby. Walter nodded grimly. That's when the fire started. Yeah. The smell returned instantly in my mind. Burning hydraulic fluid. Burned metal. Burned flesh. Some smells never leave you. Rick stared at me differently now. Not mockingly. Not confidently. Just uncertain. So how'd you get out? I almost smiled. That's the part people usually call heroic. Walter looked at me carefully. But you don't. No. I rubbed my thumb slowly across an old scar on my palm. Heroic means you had choices, I said. Most of us didn't. The truth settled heavily over the patio. I continued quietly. We lifted off overloaded and half-blind in the middle of the storm. Walter added softly, with enemy vehicles closing in. Yeah. A younger cousin near the patio door whispered, This sounds like a movie. I shook my head immediately. No, I said firmly. Movies end clean. That line stayed hanging in the warm night air. Because this part wasn't clean. Not even close. The mission report blamed mechanical failure, I said eventually. Rick frowned. But that wasn't true. No. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. Here it came. The ugliest part. The commanding officer in charge of the operation panicked, I said quietly. He ordered everybody to retreat before the ground team was secured. Aunt Donna looked confused. But if they left, those soldiers would have died. They almost did. Walter's voice turned cold. He abandoned them. I nodded once. But after we got back, politics started. Rick blinked. Politics. I laughed softly without humor. Military careers, public image, command reputation. The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Maybe because I spent years pretending it was gone. The officer responsible had powerful connections, I continued. And somebody needed to absorb the blame for the operation falling apart. Rick stared at me. You. Me. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. They said I acted recklessly, I said. Said I violated withdrawal orders. Said I endangered military assets. Walter slammed his palm softly against the table. You saved lives. Didn't matter. The old SEAL shook his head with visible anger. I tried fighting it. I know. But the brass buried everything. Yeah. The bitterness in Walter's eyes told me he'd carried this anger almost as long as I had. Rick spoke carefully now. So they punished you for rescuing people? I looked at him calmly. No, I said. They punished me for embarrassing somebody important. That hit him harder than the war stories. Because Americans over a certain age understand institutions, understand pride, understand cowardice wearing expensive uniforms. I leaned back slowly. After that, things collapsed fast. My throat tightened slightly. My marriage fell apart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't be around crowds. Every helicopter sound sent my heart racing. Walter lowered his eyes. I heard about the divorce. Yeah. I gave a faint shrug. He said the war got more of me than he ever had. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Because what do you say? Some losses happen slowly, quietly, like rust. Rick looked down at his beer for a long moment before finally speaking. So all these years, I finished the sentence for him. You thought I was just some weird old woman who hated family parties. His face flushed slightly. I mean, kinda. I actually smiled a little. At least you're honest. The tension loosened for one brief second. Then Walter spoke again, and the warmth vanished immediately. The officer who buried the truth, he said quietly. He's here in Texas tomorrow. My stomach dropped. I already knew the name before he said it. Daniel Mercer, Walter muttered darkly. Retired general now. I stared at him. Walter's expression hardened. He's the guest speaker at the Veterans Fundraiser in Austin tomorrow night. The old memories turned cold inside my chest. Because after 20 years, the man who destroyed my life was suddenly 1 hour down the highway. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid of seeing Daniel Mercer again. At my age, fear changes shape. When you're young, you fear bullets and failure and embarrassment. When you're older, you fear memories. I spent most of the night sitting on the back porch of my small house outside Temple, Texas, listening to crickets and staring into darkness while old sounds returned. Rotor blades, radio static, men screaming coordinates through gunfire. By morning, my chest already felt tired. At around 10, Walter Briggs called. You going tonight, he asked. No. You should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Mercer. Walter was quiet for a second. Claire, he said carefully, sometimes avoiding pain also means avoiding closure. I hated when old veterans got philosophical before noon. I'm not looking for closure. What are you looking for? That question lingered longer than I expected. Finally, I answered honestly. Peace. Walter sighed softly. Then maybe it's time. By 6:30 that evening, I was standing outside the Austin Veterans Memorial Center wondering why I'd ignored my own instincts. The parking lot was full. Luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, American flags mounted near the entrance. Inside, donors and retired officers mingled beneath warm chandelier lighting, while waiters carried trays of wine and shrimp cocktails. The room smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood, the kind of place where people honored sacrifice comfortably. Walter met me near the entrance. You came, still deciding if that was smart. He gave me a faint smile. You look nervous. I'm considering assaulting an elderly general. That actually made him laugh. For a moment I almost relaxed. Then I saw Daniel Mercer, and suddenly it felt like Afghanistan had reached through 20 years to grab me by the throat. Mercer stood near the ballroom stage surrounded by donors and local politicians. Tall, silver-haired, perfect posture, the kind of man America trusted instantly. He wore confidence like another military decoration. People shook his hand constantly. Veterans thanked him for his service. A younger reporter hovered nearby with a camera crew. Walter noticed my expression. You okay? No. Mercer turned slightly while laughing at something someone said. Then he saw me. His smile disappeared immediately. Not confusion, Recognition. Instant recognition. And underneath it, fear. Tiny, fast, but real. The general excused himself from the group and slowly walked toward us. Walter straightened beside me automatically. Old instincts. Mercer stopped a few feet away. Claire Donovan, he said calmly. His voice sounded exactly the same. That bothered me more than it should have. General Mercer. The title tasted bitter. His eyes scanned me carefully. You look well. That makes one of us. Walter coughed softly to hide a laugh. Mercer ignored him. I heard you left Texas years ago. I heard you rewrote history. That landed harder. The air between us tightened immediately. Mercer's polished smile returned, but thinner now. Still angry, I see. I stared directly into his eyes. Still lying, I see. Walter shifted slightly beside me. People nearby had begun noticing the tension. Mercer lowered his voice. This isn't the place. No, I replied softly. You made sure of that 20 years ago. The ballroom lights dimmed shortly afterward as guests moved toward their tables. Walter and I sat near the back. I would have left already if pride hadn't kept me planted in that chair. That's the ugly truth nobody admits. Sometimes revenge begins simply because you're tired of swallowing humiliation. An announcer stepped onto the stage. Tonight, he said warmly, we honor leadership, courage, and lifelong service. Mercer received a standing ovation before he even touched the microphone. I stayed seated. Walter did too. Mercer began speaking smoothly about patriotism and sacrifice. The crowd loved him. Of course they did. Men like Mercer always knew exactly what America wanted to hear, especially older Americans. Duty, honor, country. He spoke beautifully. That was part of the problem. Then his eyes found me again near the back table, and everything changed. There are, Mercer said into the microphone. Unfortunately, some people who never fully adjust after war. Walter stiffened beside me. I already knew where this was going. Mercer continued calmly. Trauma affects judgment, memory, emotional stability. Several people glanced toward our table now. Coward. The old anger inside me stirred awake for the first time in years. Mercer folded his hands behind his back like a statesman. Leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions under pressure. Not everyone understands those realities. Walter muttered, son of a bitch. Mercer was doing it again. Same as before. Using polished language to bury truth. The crowd listened respectfully. Most had no idea they were watching a man defend cowardice in real time. Then Mercer smiled faintly. And sadly he added some former personnel build myths around themselves afterward. Walter slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle silverware. That turned heads immediately. Mercer looked directly at him, and Walter Briggs stood up. I was there. The room went completely still. Walter's old voice carried farther than I expected. Mercer's expression darkened instantly. Walter, he warned quietly. No, Walter snapped. You've talked long enough? Guests shifted uncomfortably. Nobody moved. Walter pointed toward me. That woman flew into a goddamn firestorm while you ran. The ballroom exploded into whispers. Mercer's face turned pale. You don't know what you're talking about, he said sharply. But now another voice spoke up. I do. A man near the front slowly rose from a wheelchair. Older Marine, gray beard, missing left leg. He looked toward me with wet eyes. She saved my life. Silence swallowed the room again. Then another veteran stood. Then another. A medic. A former ranger. An elderly father holding a folded military cap. One by one they spoke. She brought my son home. She carried wounded men herself. We were told nobody was coming. Mercer's confident posture finally cracked. I sat frozen while 20 years of buried truth rose into the room like smoke. Walter stepped closer to the stage. The Kandahar files were partially declassified last year, he said loudly. People can read them now. Mercer's jaw tightened. Walter's voice shook with fury. You abandoned your men. Nobody applauded now. Nobody smiled. The ballroom had become a courtroom. And for the first time in 2 decades, Daniel Mercer looked small. Then the Marine in the wheelchair slowly raised a trembling hand to his forehead and saluted me. The entire room watched in silence, some with shock, some with shame, some with tears. And suddenly I realized something strange. After 20 years, I no longer wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding. The ballroom never fully recovered after that, even after the applause died away, even after people slowly returned to their seats. The mood had changed too much. Truth does that sometimes. Especially old truth. It settles into a room like smoke and makes everybody breathe differently. Daniel Mercer tried finishing his speech, but the confidence was gone now. People still listened politely because Americans over 60 were raised to respect uniforms and ceremony, but you could feel the shift. Once doubt enters a room, reputation starts leaking quietly through the cracks. Mercer wrapped up 10 minutes later to scattered applause. Nothing like the standing ovation from earlier. Walter leaned toward me. You okay? I watched Mercer step away from the podium while avoiding eye contact with half the ballroom. I don't know yet. And that was the truth. I'd spent 20 years imagining what justice would feel like. Turns out, it mostly felt exhausting. The fundraiser ended shortly afterward. Clusters of veterans and donors gathered around the lobby speaking in hushed voices. Several older men approached me carefully. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. That's how older veterans usually handle respect. One retired ranger shook my hand and said, "Thank you for bringing our boys home." Another man in a Vietnam veteran cap hugged me without saying a word. A woman in her 70s pressed a folded photograph into my hand. "My son talked about you before he died," she whispered. I looked down at the picture. Young Marine, big smile, desert camouflage. My chest tightened immediately. "Oh," I whispered softly, "I remember him." And I did. That was the burden nobody explains about surviving war. You carry faces forever. The woman squeezed my hand gently. "He said you stayed calm when everybody else panicked." I almost laughed at that. I'd never felt calm once in my entire military career. But soldiers often mistake quiet fear for courage. Walter and I eventually stepped outside into the warm Austin night air. The fundraiser noise faded behind us while traffic moved steadily along the nearby highway. Texas nights always smell faintly like dust and gasoline in summer. Walter lit a cigarette despite probably being told not to by 6 different doctors. "You know this is gonna spread fast," he said. I figured. The veteran community never forgets names. I leaned against the concrete railing outside the building. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I spent 20 years trying to disappear." Walter gave a tired smile. "And one barbecue ruined it." That actually made me laugh for real. The first real laugh in a long time. Then Walter grew serious again. "You deserved better, Claire." I stared out toward the parking lot lights. Maybe once years ago hearing that would have mattered more. But age changes your relationship with fairness. At some point you realize life rarely balances the books cleanly. "You know what I regret most?" I asked quietly. Walter shook his head. I let bitterness isolate me. The old SEAL didn't answer immediately, because he understood. Veterans are very good at isolation. We build entire lives around avoiding pain. And after enough years, loneliness starts feeling normal. By the next morning, the story had already started moving through military circles online. Walter wasn't kidding. Calls came all day. Old pilots, former medics, retired officers. People I hadn't spoken to in decades somehow found my number within hours. One man cried on the phone before saying a single word. Another simply said, "Thought you should know." We never believed the official story. That one hit harder than I expected. Because deep down I think part of me always believed I'd truly been abandoned by everybody. Turns out silence and betrayal aren't always the same thing. Around noon, Rick showed up at my house unexpectedly. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while I was watering tomato plants. He climbed out awkwardly, holding a paper bag from a local bakery. That alone told me he was nervous. Rick normally apologized with jokes, not pastries. I set the hose down. "What's in the bag?" "Peach turnovers." I nodded slowly. "That's serious, huh?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Can I come in?" We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. Rick looked uncomfortable in the way middle-aged men do when they realize they've behaved badly. Finally he sighed. "I owe you an apology." "You do?" He nodded. "I was an ass." "Also true." That earned a weak smile. Then his face turned serious again. "I really thought you were exaggerating at the barbecue." "I know." "No," he said quietly. I thought you were lonely." That surprised me. Rick stared down into his coffee. "You always stayed away from people," he admitted. "I figured maybe you wanted attention." I leaned back slowly. "That's fair." "No," he said immediately. "It isn't." The sincerity in his voice softened something inside me. Rick looked around my small kitchen. "You've been carrying all this alone." I gave a small shrug. "For a while." He shook his head slowly. "That general..." He paused. "How does somebody live with doing that to another person?" I thought about Daniel Mercer standing on that stage pretending to be honorable. Then I answered honestly. "Probably the same way the rest of us survive hard things." Rick frowned. "How?" "By lying to ourselves carefully." 3 days later, Mercer called me personally. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. His voice sounded older now. Not physically older. Spiritually older. "Claire," he said quietly, "could we meet?" Every instinct told me no. But another part of me, the tired part, wanted the story finished properly. So we met at a small diner outside Georgetown. Nothing dramatic. Just coffee and silence. Mercer looked terrible. The polished confidence was gone. Without the podium and medals, he suddenly seemed like what he truly was, an aging man carrying decades of shame. He stared at his untouched coffee for a long time before speaking. I was afraid he admitted. I said nothing. The storm hit, communications collapsed, and I panicked. There it was. Not strategy, not politics. Cowardice. Simple human cowardice. His eyes looked wet now. I kept telling myself withdrawing was tactical. He swallowed hard. But the truth is, I was terrified. I watched him carefully. This was the man I'd hated for 20 years, and suddenly he just looked tired. Broken even. Mercer rubbed his trembling hands together. You want to know something awful? I stayed silent. I hated you, he whispered. Because every time someone mentioned your name, I remembered exactly who I really was. The diner grew quiet around us. Older couples drank coffee nearby. Country music played softly overhead. Ordinary American life continuing around two damaged people. Mercer finally looked up at me. After everything I did, he asked hoarsely, why didn't you destroy me years ago? I stared at him for a very long time before answering. Because the truth was, I'd spent 20 years asking myself the exact same question. Daniel Mercer sat across from me in that little diner looking like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway while pickup trucks rolled past in steady Texas traffic. Inside, a waitress refilled coffee cups and called everybody honey. Ordinary life. That's the strange thing about heavy moments. The world never pauses for them. Mercer waited for my answer. Why didn't you destroy me years ago? I looked down at my coffee for a long moment before speaking. Because hatred gets heavy, I said quietly. He blinked slowly. You carry it long enough. Eventually it carries you. The old general lowered his eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mercer looked completely honest. Not polished, not commanding. Just tired. I told myself I was protecting careers, he admitted softly. Protecting the military. Protecting morale. I nodded once. That's how people survive guilt. They rename it. Mercer swallowed hard. I ruined your life. For years, hearing those words was all I thought I wanted. Some admission, some apology, some recognition. But sitting there across from him, I realized something important. Pain doesn't disappear just because somebody finally admits they caused it. It still happened. The lost years still existed. The nightmares still existed. The divorce papers, the panic attacks, the isolation, none of that magically vanished. But strangely, the anger had already started fading before this conversation even began. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. That's good, I replied calmly, because forgiveness isn't a transaction. He nodded faintly. Then we sat quietly for a while, listening to dishes clatter behind the counter. Two old people carrying different kinds of regret. A week later, Walter invited me to a veterans support gathering in Killeen. Small room, nothing fancy. Just folding chairs, coffee, and older veterans trying to help younger ones stay afloat after service. Normally, I would have refused. For years, I avoided veteran events whenever possible. Too many ghosts in one room? But this time felt different. Maybe because something inside me had finally loosened. Maybe because after spending decades hiding from my past, I was getting tired of running from it. Walter introduced me simply. This is Claire. No dramatic speech, no medals, no war stories. Just Claire. And honestly, I appreciated that more than he probably realized. The group included young soldiers recently back from overseas, a few older Vietnam vets, one Marine missing 2 fingers, another man who barely spoke the entire evening. I recognized that silence immediately. Trauma has a sound, and sometimes the sound is nothing at all. Walter eventually asked if I'd share something. At first I didn't want to. Then I noticed one younger veteran sitting near the wall staring down at the floor exactly the way I used to after Afghanistan. That look changed my mind, so I stood slowly and spoke. I began quietly. People hear military stories and think the hardest part is combat. Several veterans nodded slightly. But for a lot of us, I continued, the hardest part comes afterward. The room stayed completely still. I spoke slowly, carefully, not like a speech, more like a confession. You come home and everybody expects you to return to normal immediately. A few bitter laughs moved through the room. But war changes the speed of your thinking, I said. Changes how you sleep, changes how safe the world feels. The younger veteran near the wall finally looked up at me. For years I admitted I thought isolation was strength. Walter watched quietly from the back. I thought shutting people out protected me. I smiled faintly. But loneliness is sneaky. It starts feeling comfortable after a while. Several older veterans nodded hard at that one. Because they knew. God, they knew. One man finally raised his hand. Gray-haired Army veteran, probably early 70s. Can I ask something? Sure. He hesitated. Why'd they call you Hades? A few people in the room shifted curiously. I looked down at my hands before answering. For years, people assumed the call sign meant something dark, dangerous, violent. But the truth was never what they expected. The first team that gave me the name, I said softly, used it after a rescue mission went bad. The room stayed silent. I smiled gently. One of the SEALs said, I paused briefly, no matter how deep into hell we got, she always came back for us. Nobody spoke afterward. Not immediately. Because older Americans understand something younger audiences sometimes miss. The most meaningful moments usually arrive quietly. No music, no explosions. Just truth landing softly inside a room. After the meeting ended, several younger veterans stayed behind, talking longer than they probably intended. One thanked me for speaking honestly about isolation. Another admitted he hadn't talked to his own daughter in 8 months. That one hurt to hear. Before leaving, the quiet young veteran from earlier finally approached me near the coffee table. He looked nervous. You really think people can come back from that stuff? He asked. From what? He shrugged helplessly. The darkness. I studied him carefully. Then, I answered the only honest way I knew how. Not completely, I said, but enough to live again. His eyes watered slightly. He nodded once. And somehow, that moment mattered more to me than every medal I'd ever received. That evening I drove home alone beneath a deep orange Texas sunset. Windows down, warm air rolling through the truck. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I thought about Aunt Donna, Walter, Rick, even Daniel Mercer. Life had wounded all of us differently. Some people responded with arrogance, some with guilt, some with isolation. But underneath it all, most people were simply trying to survive themselves. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck a little longer, watching evening light settle across the fields. And I realized something. People thought Hades meant death, fear, violence. But they were wrong. It meant bringing people back from hell, including yourself. And maybe that's true for more people than we realize. Maybe some of us spend years carrying pain silently because we think nobody else would understand. Maybe pride keeps families apart longer than it should. Maybe forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, but finally refusing to let bitterness become your final identity. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you forgave, or even a part of yourself you're still trying to heal, then I hope you'll carry that feeling forward. Share it with somebody who might need it. And remember, sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're simply the ones who survived and chose kindness anyway.